Another 6 months passed and Bastila was laughing at her apprentice's anxiousness. "Anakin, calm yourself, you're about ready to go through the window of your cockpit," she teased. "I haven't seen her in over a year, Bastila," he answered anxiously. Bastila chuckled lightly. "You'll see her soon," she assured him. Anakin let out a deep breath as they entered Coruscant's atmosphere. Landing his fighter, Anakin got out, making the woman chuckle lightly. He was like a child getting everything he wanted for his life day. "Is there anything you need me to do, Bastila?" he asked. "You could put your mask on," she replied with a half grin. Anakin stared at the mask that was still sitting in the cockpit of his ship. "Really? Do I have to?" he asked with a sigh. "Just until you get back to the apartment to change into your civilian attire. It would look quite strange to everyone who'll see you dressed in civilian clothes, but with your chest armor on," she commented. Sighing, the young man pulled his mask on. "I have to speak with Obi-Wan, I will talk to you later," she told him. Anakin nodded before heading towards his and Padme's apartment to change out of his Justice disguise and into some actual normal-fitting clothes. Walking to the Senate building, Anakin walked in wearing his civilian clothes, but had on his cloak to hide his face, so no one could see his face. Making his way through the halls, he smiled when he saw Padme walking the opposite direction. Glancing around, he made his way toward her office, smiling as Dorm opened the doors for him. "She'll be in momentarily," she told him. "Alright, make sure no one comes once she's in here," he instructed the handmaiden. She nodded with a smile and sat back down, while Anakin pushed the security camera away before removing his hood. Once the doors closed, Anakin stood in a corner waiting for his wife to come in. Padme sighed as she glanced at Dorm. "Did those reports come in yet?" she asked. "Yep, everything you've been waiting for is in your office," Dorm replied. "Good, tell everyone who calls that I'm going to be too busy to take any calls or go to any meetings," Padme informed her friend. "Already done, Melody," Dorm replied. Nodding, the young senator went into her office, sighing as she put her datapad down on the desk. Turning around, she let out a gasp to see someone standing in the corner. Seeing who it was, she couldn't help but let the smile appear on her face as she hurried over to her fiancé, hugging him tight. Smiling, Anakin lifted her up off the floor, swinging her around once. Setting her back down on the floor, he placed his hands on her waist, kissing her gently. "You're home," she said happily, hugging him tight once their kiss broke. "I'm home," he answered, hugging her back. He buried his face into her neck, closing his eyes. "I've missed you so much," he told her. "I miss you," she answered with tears in her eyes. Pulling away again, he kissed her once more while resting his hands on the sides of her neck, tracing her jaw with his thumbs. Their kiss broke again and she smiled at him. "Your hair is getting a little longer," she commented. "Just a little," he replied with a smile, chuckling. He rested his forehead against hers while moving his hands over her back. "I swear you grow more beautiful every time I see you," he told her softly. She laughed a little, closing her eyes as he brushed his nose over hers. He kissed her tenderly again, nipping at her bottom lip. Anakin moved his hands over her arms, pulling her closer if it were possible, and began covering her face with kisses. "If I knew you were going to be home, I would have taken the day off," she said between kisses. "Would you now?" he asked with a smile as he began nipping at her neck. "Yes, I would," she replied, letting out a sigh as he continued caressing her neck with kisses. She laughed a little as he nibbled on her shoulder. "Security cameras, Ani," she told him, pulling back. "Security camera won't see us," he answered. "Well, not here," she told him laughing. "Tease," he groaned, "letting me kiss you like that, but then you tell me no. She laughed a little when his comlink went off. He cursed lightly, closing his eyes. "Skywalker," he answered. "Anakin, I need you here. We need to help Obi-Wan with a mission," Bastila informed her apprentice. "Why?" he asked. "Because it's the right thing to do, Anakin," she replied, chuckling lightly. "Alright, I'm on my way," he said with a sigh. Padme held his hand. "I'm going with you," she told him. "Out of the question," he answered. "I'm going with you whether you tell me I am or not." "I'll follow you," she answered. Sighing, he knew she would and kissed her forehead gently. "Alright," he murmured. They left the office to go meet with Bastila. Padme was dressed in one of her fighting uniforms while Anakin had on his Justice armor. They hurried over to the platform where Bastila was waiting. "What's going on here?" she asked. "She's coming," Anakin replied. "I don't think that's a good idea," Bastila told him. "You tell her that," he replied. Anakin jumped into his fighter while Padme got into the open cockpit behind him. "Melody, this isn't safe," Bastila told her. "I can handle it, I'm going," Padme answered. Bastila shook her head while Anakin got everything ready. Bastila got into her fighter, and they flew off to find Obi-Wan. On the planet Azure, the three of them caught up with Obi-Wan and Siritachi in the middle of a fight against Bounty Hunter, Magus, and his army. Anakin blocked several blasts from droids aimed at him with his double-sided lightsaber, jumping in the air when one droid threw a flamethrower at him. "Justice, you alright?" Bastila called over the comlink. "I'm a little cooked, but I'll live," he replied. Reaching up with the Force, Anakin lifted the droid off its feet, throwing it into a group of other droids. At the same time he was still dodging and blocking blasts aimed at him. "We have to catch up with Siri and the Senator," Obi-Wan told him. I agree, Anakin answered as they tried to finishing off the rest of the droids coming after them. Padme looked through to the front to see Magus's ship right in front of them. Right there. She called out. I see him, Senator, can you fly this? She asked. Yes, Padme replied sitting down. I'm going to go after him before he escapes, she informed her friends. Siri, I don't think that's a good idea, Bastila answered. Do you have any better ideas? Siri demanded. Bastila was silent before the Jedi carefully climbed out of the ship. Moving to the front of it, she took a deep breath before jumping from her ship and onto Magus's ship. Keep following them, Padme, Bastila told her. I am, Padme answered. They watched as the Jedi fought against the bounty hunter. I have a bad feeling about this, a really bad feeling, she murmured. Just then, Magus's ship crash landed, and Bastila ran over to arrest the bounty hunter. Great work, Siri, Padme told her. Siri had her hand pressed against her side, wincing. Thanks, she answered before collapsing to her knees. Siri, the senator exclaimed, grabbing the woman before she hit the ground. Obi-Wan and Anakin arrived, and the Jedi Master ran over to Siri. Siri, he exclaimed, pulling her into his arms. Anakin held Padme up, resting his hands on her shoulders. Obi-Wan held Siri in one arm while he tried to heal her blaster wound on her side with the Force. No, Obi-Wan, no, she said softly, grabbing his arm. Obi-Wan stared down at her. I have to save you, he insisted. It's too late, she answered, staring up at him. The Jedi Master stared at the woman in his arms, feeling his heart beginning to sink. No, no, he murmured when he felt her life force beginning to fade. Siri stared up at him, holding his hand in hers. I know we said we would never speak of it again, but I love you, she confessed softly. Obi-Wan squeezed her hand gently. I love you too, please stay with me, please, he answered. She hushed him softly, resting her hand on his cheek. It's alright, she told him softly, I'm not afraid to die. Feeling his heart begin to break, Obi-Wan looked down as she placed something into his hand. Looking down, he saw her blue warming crystal from their first mission together sitting in the palm of his hand. Siri closed his hand around the crystal, swallowing hard. I'll always be with you, she whispered before she fell limp in his arms. Anakin closed his eyes, wrapping his arms tightly around Padme as she cried softly. Seeing the exchange and feeling Obi-Wan's pain was difficult. He looked back toward him as the Jedi Master carefully placed Siri's now limp body on the ground, beginning to shake with anger. Obi-Wan, Anakin called as he stood up from the ground. Bastila's eyes whitened when Obi-Wan grabbed his lightsaber from the ground. Obi-Wan, don't. She called out to him. Ignoring them, Obi-Wan looked toward Magus and ignited the blade. Looking toward the bounty hunter, he ran over to him ready to decapitate him for what he had done. Except suddenly, Obi-Wan stopped with his blade inches from the bounty hunter's neck. He just glared at the bounty hunter for the longest time, but then he shoved him backwards, making Magus fall to the ground. What good would it be to kill you now? He muttered before deactivating his lightsaber. Anakin, Padme, and Bastila were all standing there as Obi-Wan lifted Siri's lifeless body up into his arms and carried her back to the ship. Ani, Padme said gently, holding onto his arm. Anakin looked down at her, giving her hand a squeeze. He needs time, he said softly. The man has more sense than I would if I were in his position. Padme wrapped her arms tightly around his arm as they all went back to the ship. Anakin wrapped his arms tightly around his fiancée, kissing the side of her head. Sitting in the back of the ship, Obi-Wan was sitting in silence with his head lowered. Bastila removed her mask as she opened the door. Obi-Wan, she called quietly as the door slid open. I'm really not in the mood to talk right now, Bastila, he told her. Bastila sat next to him. That's fine, I'm here as a friend comforting another friend, she answered. Obi-Wan just sat there, staring at the wall. We knew each other all our lives. I would have done anything for her, anything, he murmured. I can believe it, she murmured. Bastila suddenly reached over, hugging him gently. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Swallowing hard, Obi-Wan lowered his head. It's not fair, he said softly as the grief gripped him over the fact that she was gone. Bastila was silent as she just let him grieve. She was the shoulder he could lean on. They sat in silence in the back of the ship, and she just continued to comfort him through the rest of the trip back home. 2 weeks went by since the fight on Azure. Since their return to Naboo, Anakin wanted to talk to Padme about their future together. Walking in front outside, the young man was covered in grease from working on a broken-down speeder in the Naboo's garage. Speeder should run like new now, he told his soon-to-be father-in-law, as he continued to wipe his hands on the rag he had with him. Your skills never cease to impress me, Rui commented chuckling. Anakin smiled before he grabbed Azure out of the basket on the table. Don't spoil your appetite, Jobel scolded the young man with a smile. I would, he answered with a grin. Jobel shook her head slowly. Maybe we can actually get Padme to sit down and talk about the wedding now that you're here. Whenever she's home we can hardly get any ideas out of her, Sola commented, looking up from the book she was reading. Why should I make plans when Anakin's not around to give his opinion? Padme asked as she walked downstairs from her room. Anakin gave her a half-smile. As I told you before, I don't care what it is, as long as I'm marrying you, it's going to be perfect, he answered, kissing her briefly. I told her that too, but she wouldn't listen, Sola commented. Padme shot a glare at her sister. Well, before we discuss anything, you need to shower, she told Anakin, poking his chest. Anakin grinned. Yeah, I think getting cleaned up would be a good idea, he agreed, smiling. He kissed her forehead before going upstairs. He seems to have filled out more since the last time he was here, Sola commented. He's been training hard, Padme answered as she sat down. It is nice to have him here for a while. How long is he staying? Jobel asked. A couple of weeks, then we're both returning to Coruscant, Padme replied. I think the boy will be stir crazy by that point, Rui commented, chuckling. Padme smiled a little as she twisted her engagement ring on her finger. Anakin has been more attentive since the mission on Azure, she answered, looking towards the stairs. How's your friend, Obi-Wan, since then? Sola asked. From what Anakin has told me, he's doing alright, still focusing on his missions. He's put on the face of loyal to the Jedi code, as his way to not have to talk about it, Padme replied with a sigh. Such a shame that the Jedi have to be so cold about having attachments, Jobel commented. At least they didn't bring Anakin to the Order. Imagine how things would have turned out, Sola agreed. Padme bit her lower lip as she glanced up the stairs again. Yes, it is hard to imagine how things would have turned out if the Jedi would have accepted him into the Order, she murmured. After his shower, Anakin stood in the room he and Padme were sharing together as he stared at the holopics on the wall. The new one she had put up made him smile. It was taken 2 days after they first became engaged. The two of them had gone to Veracino to get an idea of how they would want their wedding. They had gone on a picnic that day. Anakin was leaning sideways, leaning on his arm that was down on the ground. Padme was lying the opposite direction of him with her back toward his leg that was propped up, and he had his other hand resting on her waist. She had her left hand resting over his fingers. Her engagement ring was reflecting the sunrays off it. He had on his boots, black pants, and a light brown tunic. Padme had on a yellow dress with purple printed flowers on the top half of the gown. Her brown hair was half pinned up while the rest of her curls hung over her shoulders. Anakin smiled at the memory as he fastened his belt around his waist. They weren't really planning to have any pictures taken that day. It was just a relaxing day in the meadow. The weather was perfect and the sun was just right in the sky, and they decided to take advantage of it, and they had R2 take the holopic for them. Sighing, he pulled his tunic on when he heard the door open. Dinner's about ready, Ani, Padme told him, walking in. I'll be right down, he answered. Seeing that he was staring at what was her favorite holopic of them, she walked up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. Seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? She asked. Anakin ran his hands over hers with a sigh. Almost, he murmured, when times were easier, quieter. No politics, no plotting, no war, she answered. Anakin ran his fingers over her hands, letting out a sigh. What's even more frustrating is that I don't know when I'll be home again, he murmured. Turning around, he rested his hands on her waist. I have no idea when I'll see you again after I leave Coruscant with Bastila, he told her. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. Padme reached up, resting her hand on the back of his neck. It wouldn't be forever, Ani, she answered quietly. It always feels like forever, he told her. Padme wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, closing her eyes. Anakin rested his forehead against the side of her head as he moved his arms around her back. After a while, the two of them went back downstairs. We thought you two disappeared, Sola teased lightly. We had to talk about a few things, Padme answered as they sat back down. This war is ridiculous, countless lives are being lost, and I can't save them all, Anakin muttered. Padme rested her hand on her fiancé's arm. No war talk this evening, Rui told them. They nodded as they started eating the dinner Jobel and Sola made. So do you two have any solid plans for the wedding at all? Sola asked, trying to bring up a happier topic. Anakin gave Padme's hand a squeeze. We already decided we'd like to get married in Veracino, he replied. Oh? That would be so beautiful and perfect. Sola said excitedly. As for the date, we're not sure. It's as soon as I'm done with my training. I would like to get my mother, Klieg, Owen, and Bearer from Tatooine, so they could be here, he added. Of course, their family, Jobel answered, smiling. Anakin smiled. How's your mother, by the way? Jobel asked. She's doing well. I saw her for a few days before coming here, he replied. That's good to hear, Rui commented. Tatooine, though, I wish I could say was getting better. If anything, it's getting worse. The Hutt seem to be profiting from this war, he answered. I came across a smuggler's ship on my way here. They weren't smuggling spices this time, though. Padme's eyes whitened. Oh no, she murmured. They were all kids, Padme, all of them. Some not much older than I was when you and Qui-Gon found me, he answered. What? Sola asked. Slaves, Sola, children's slaves, Padme replied. I still can't believe there's slavery in the galaxy, Jobel murmured, shaking her head. Anakin sighed. The Republic doesn't exist on Tatooine, and it frustrates me that the Republic won't do anything about it, he answered. Why can't they just escape? Sola asked. You make it sound so easy, Sola. They put a chip somewhere in your body that if you try to escape it'll blow you sky high, he answered. And you were a slave? Rui asked. The young man nodded his head slowly. My mother and I both were. I was born into it. My mother was captured and sold into slavery when she was 6. She's been sold to some really horrible slave owners, and she had one that wanted to free her but died before doing so. Then when I was born, 3 years later we were sent to Tatooine where we were sold to Gardulla the Hutt, he explained, practically spitting out the Hutt's name as he spoke. Padme looked at Anakin with sad eyes as she kept her hand on his arm. The Hutts are monsters, especially to their women slaves. I was too young to understand at the time, but now that I'm older, he trailed off, feeling his blood boil at the thought. You don't have to get into that, Ani, Padme told him. I don't plan to, he answered. He let out a deep breath. Anyways, Gardulla had an addiction to gambling, and she gambled that I would lose at the Boon to Eve Classic, and tried to make it so I would lose. Instead, I won and she lost my mother and me to a junk shop owner, Watto. He was kinder than Gardulla to say the least, he explained. He let out a deep breath. He was more of an employer than a slave owner. He allowed my mother and I to have some possessions, when other slave owners wouldn't have their slaves have anything at all. When I was 9, I had heard rumors going around the slave compounds that Gardulla had been trying to negotiate with Watto, he explained. Negotiate what? Padme asked. My price, she wanted me back, he answered. Yobel shook her head. It's disgusting to hear about people being talked about as if they are supplies, she commented, sitting back. It is obvious that Gardulla didn't succeed, we commented. No, Qui-Gon won my freedom from Watto and took me from Tatooine before she could even try to negotiate a different price, he answered. Ani, you never told me that, Padme said softly. It was past business, there was no reason to bring it up, he answered. Padme rested her chin over his shoulder. I didn't realize that you lived such a hard life before you met Padme, Sola commented softly. Actually, I met Anakin when he was still a slave, Sola. When I was queen, we were stranded on Tatooine, and I followed Qui-Gon to Mos Espa, she answered. Anakin wrapped his arm around Padme's back as she pulled her chair closer to his, smiling at the memory. So you won your freedom? Sola asked. I did, Anakin replied. Pottersing goes a long way on Tatooine. What happened to your mother if she was still a slave when you left Tatooine? Ryu asked. Sola looked at her daughter. Klieg bought my mother's freedom, Anakin replied. I am grateful that he was able to do so. What happened to the kids you found? Ryu asked. I rescued them, he replied, but then he frowned a little. Right now they're in an orphanage on Coruscant. What about their mommies and daddies? Kruha asked. Anakin sighed. He didn't have the heart to tell the child that the children might never see their parents again. I'm going to try to find them, he answered. Padme stood up. Ani, I was going to show you this later, but I think you should see it now, she told him, standing up. Padme walked over to her bag and pulled out her datapad. Walking back over to the table, she placed the datapad in front of him. Lifting it up, Anakin started going through the information in front of him. It's a bill to abolish slavery on Tatooine, she told him. Padme, this is great, but I'm not sure if the Republic can actually enforce this, he answered. Why not? She asked. There's no real military to enforce this. The Republic is too busy using the clones for their own uses to use the military on an actual cause, he replied. Padme bit her lower lip. Thank you for the effort, he murmured, kissing her forehead softly. He kept the datapad with him. He hoped one day the Republic would listen to this bill and pass the law, once he freed the slaves on Tatooine. Padme held his hand as they all sat and enjoyed their dinner quietly. Anakin sighed as he walked up the stairs to the Senate building wearing his civilian clothes. He wore black boots, dark brown pants, a tan tunic, and a dark brown cloak. He had just returned from another spying mission, but this time he had been on one of the Republic's ships, finding out what their plans were going to be. Pulling his hood over his head, Anakin walked through the halls to find that the meeting was about to start. Walking up behind Padme, he rested his hand on her shoulder, making her turn around. Smiling brightly to see Anakin standing there, she hugged him tightly around his neck. What, no hiding in my office surprises today? She quipped quietly. Not today. I need to hear what's going on in the Senate, he replied quietly. Spying on the Senate now? She asked quietly, raising her eyebrow. I spy on everyone, he replied with a smile. It is my job after all. She shook her head slowly. How can one not have a loyalty to anything? She asked curiously as they stood on the deck by their hover. I have loyalty, just to you, my mother, Bastila, and Obi-Wan, he replied with a half-grin. That's comforting to know, she commented. Chuckling, he rested his hand on her slender waist, leading her into their hover. I haven't been impressed by either side to make an alliance with any of them, he commented. You're basically talking treason, Ani, she answered quietly. That's doing what's right, something that should have been done from the start, he told her before standing in the back. Is there a difference? She asked, looking at him. Yes, because I will protect the Republic if it needs to be protected, and yet I can go against it at the same time, he replied. She gave him a small smile before she walked over, holding his hand in hers. And you know I'm one to do so, she told him. Anakin smiled, stroking her cheek gently, before letting her go so the meeting could begin. Anakin made sure to hide himself in the Force, but he also kept his mind open for anything or anyone that could be a threat to Padme's safety. He had overheard that there would be another assassination attempt on Padme's life. Bastila let him leave in the middle of their spying mission, since she had sensed it as well. With his training coming to an end, Bastila was giving him more free rein on his decisions. His eyes kept scanning the room when he saw the Chancellor almost glaring at Padme, as she was trying to make her argument about finding a diplomatic solution to the war. I am sorry, Senator Amidala, but the possibility of negotiations with the Separatists is impossible right now. While Count Dooku and General Grievous are controlling the war, he informed. Padme let out a defeated sigh. Anakin shook his head slowly as he listened to the Chancellor go to the next problem another senator was bringing up. After the meeting that day, Anakin was escorting Padme out of the building when he suddenly had a bad feeling. Padme, get down, he exclaimed, pushing her to the ground and covered her with his body from a suddenly blast that passed right over them and crashed into the Senate building. Getting up, Anakin held her up from the ground when someone jumped down in front of them. Anakin stood up to see a woman standing in front of them with a glare. She gave them a half smile. Well, looks like I have myself a challenge, she commented. Who are you? Anakin demanded. Or Sing, and you're in my way of getting my job done, she answered with an evil smirk. And I don't care, Anakin answered when the bounty hunter pulled out her lightsaber. Reaching to the back of his belt, he pulled out his vibroblade. Anakin blocked an attack aimed at his head before jumping over the blade, as she aimed it at his legs. Aiming at the woman's head, he took a swipe at her when she blocked the attack. Grabbing a hold of the young man's arm, she tried to use her elbow to get him in the face, when he ducked under her arm, having his arm pinned behind his back. Using his leg, he knocked the bounty hunter off her feet, making her release his arm. Ori jumped back to her feet, calling her lightsaber back. Anakin blocked and swiped at his middle, but then aimed a jab at her side. She blocked the attack, then held her lightsaber above her head to bring it down on Anakin's head. Holding his vibroblade up, the lightsaber crashed against the blade, the crimson red weapon just inches from his face. Or let out a hiss as she pulled back her blade, then acted as if she was going to aim at his throat. Anakin went to dodge the attack when he felt the searing hot pain go down the right side of his face, making him cry out in pain. Anakin. Padme shouted as Anakin held his wounded face. With one eye open, Anakin took his vibroblade and threw it at the woman. Or let out a scream of pain as his blade pierced through her shoulder. Ripping the weapon from her shoulder, she treated and Anakin fell to his side, holding his face in pain. Padme ran over. Ani. She gasped, pulling his hood back. She looked at Tifo. Don't just stand there, get some help, she exclaimed. Tifo went to get some medics, while Padme turned back to Anakin. Let me see, she told him as she tried to get him to pull his hand away. Force, it hurts, Anakin exclaimed painfully, refusing to let Padme look at his injury. They all ran over, shocked to see the young man writhing on the ground was the young boy he had heard so much about, the boy who saved Naboo from the Trade Federation blockade, and was the good friend Senator Amidala spoke highly about. Padme continued to stroke her fiancé's hair with a worried expression on her face. She looked around, hoping for help to arrive. Obi-Wan, who was there with Yoda to listen in on the Senate meeting, hurried over to the injured young man. Come on, let's get you up, Obi-Wan told him, helping Anakin off the ground. Medics hurried over to Anakin just as the young man got to his feet with his friend's help. Let's have a look here, one medic told him, trying to pull Anakin's hand from the injury, as they got him to sit down. Stop that woman, Anakin insisted as he looked around for Or. She's gone, Ani, Padme answered, holding his hand as she sat beside him on the stairs. The medic looked at the injury over his eye. We need to get him to the hospital, get this taken care of. It could get infected, he explained as they got Anakin away from the Senate building and into the medical speeder waiting for them on the platform. Senator, Bale called. Padme looked at her friend. Not now, Bale, I have to go, she told him before hurrying after the medic and Anakin. At the hospital, Anakin had back to over the injury on his eye, as well as the 2 nicks on his jaw that he didn't realize he had. How are you feeling? Padme asked. Like there's fire over my eye and jaw, he replied as she stroked his hair. Padme kissed his forehead gently. She was grateful when the medic assured him that it wasn't a serious injury, and there wouldn't be damage to his sight. There would be a scar, but that was the least of her worries. Letting out a sigh, she continued to stroke Anakin's hair. Yoda wants to speak with you, she told him softly after another minute. Great, he muttered, closing his good eye. She stroked his good cheek gently before Yoda walked in. Good to see you it is, Anakin, Yoda told him. Anakin closed his eyes, trying to keep his frustrations from surfacing. The last he wanted was to give this Jedi Master the satisfaction that he still had those sort of feelings. Wish the feeling was mutual, he answered at last. Hostile you are, Yoda commented. Not hostile, Master Yoda, just trained and my eye is burning from the attack, Anakin replied. Yoda stared at the young man. Even though the last time we spoke, you were sending me back to my life on Tatooine. Did I ever thank you for that, by the way? He asked sarcastically. Ani, Padme said softly. The right choice, it was, I feel, Yoda answered. The right choice it was not, Anakin mocked. Too attached to your mother you were. Dangerous to the Jedi Order you would have been, Yoda told him. Anakin stared at the ceiling. Well, I'm not a Jedi, and you've probably figured out that I am the fiancé Padme has been keeping quiet for the last 2.5 years, he answered. I'm smart it is not, reckless you are, Yoda told him. I'm not one of your worthless Jedi Padawans, so you have no right to tell me whether or not I should be in a relationship, Anakin answered. He suddenly sat up, glaring at the Jedi Master. And who are you to tell me I'm reckless? I just fought a Force-forsaken bounty hunter with a vibroblade instead of one of your laser swords, he added. Anakin calmed down, Padme insisted softly. No Padme, he's calling me reckless after I did the job they obviously couldn't do, he told her. Yoda shook his head slowly. Have a weapon you do, good fighter you are, he commented. You have to be when you're trying to fight off slave owners and Tusken Raiders on Tatooine, but you wouldn't know that since you've never been there, Anakin told him as he lied back down. A better life you lead, Yoda commented. Anakin shook his head slowly. A slave's life is not a better life, but of course you wouldn't know that, he answered. I have a family, people who care about me. You don't know any of that because it's attachment, which I believe is more selfish. Selfish you say? Yoda asked. Yes, selfish to not care at all. You say you're supposed to show compassion, but I didn't see you showing compassion to a 9-year-old slave boy. All of you Jedi are jealous, selfish beings, Anakin answered. Yoda stared at the young man. Selfless the Jedi are not, he told him. I don't believe that, because if you are selfless then you wouldn't have been afraid of me, you wouldn't have basically insulted me, Anakin answered. Insult you we did not. Yoda scolded. Anakin glared. No. Clouded this boy's future is. How is it not an insult? He demanded. Clouded it truly is. Unpredictable you are, Yoda answered. Why? Because I love. He demanded. Because I have that fear of losing everyone I do love. Fear turns into anger, anger turns to hate, and hate turns to suffering, Yoda told him. The young man shook his head slowly. Who shouldn't have fear? If one has no fear then they are either lying or just cold-blooded. Anger is part of being a living being as well as hate. It depends what forces the hand of hate, Anakin answered. Padme rested her hand on Anakin's shoulder. What are you going to do, Yoda? When Padme and I have children, are you going to be selfish and steal our children away? He demanded. Steal children we do not, Yoda answered irritably. You take children from their families, Anakin told him. Consult with the parents we do, ask for permission we do. Steal we do not, Yoda argued. Well you better not show your faces around if my children have the midichlorian count to be accepted into the order, because I would never let my children set a foot inside your temple. I refuse to watch my children become heartless cold machines, he answered. Yoda shook his head slowly. What did you want here, Yoda? After 12.5 years what could you possibly want? He demanded. To see if you have changed, I wanted. Right I was that you haven't, Yoda answered. Well now that we have that established how about going away? Anakin suggested coldly. Yoda left the room and Padme looked at Anakin. I don't trust them just as much as they don't trust me, he muttered. Walking over to his bed again, Padme removed the back-to bandages to check on his injuries. These are going to scar, she said softly, wanting to change the subject for a minute. Doesn't matter, you're safe, he answered, pulling her close. Padme kissed the side of his head. Ani, did you have to start an argument? She asked after a few minutes of silence. The Jedi have betrayed me, Padme. They sent me back to a life of slavery. If it weren't for Bastila, I probably would have been picked up by Gardulla the Hutt, and I'd be all the way back to square one in my life, he answered. You're not a slave anymore, she said softly. Padme kissed his good cheek gently. I love you, she told him softly. Anakin rested his head on her shoulder. I love you, he answered, closing his eyes. They stood in silence, both thinking over the conversation that took place, but then they fell asleep on his hospital cot. The doctors and nurses who came in to check on them ended up leaving them alone, which was fine by them. As long as they had each other, they had their own peace. Anakin stared straight forward as he flew his fighter, hearing R2 chirp in the wing beside him. Lock onto the ship R2, search for the shield generator, he told the droid who was happy to oblige. Anakin, track down Grievous's ship. If you get rid of Grievous, imagine all the lives we can save, Bastila instructed her apprentice over the comm. Anakin smiled at the idea. Many lives, he agreed, but the war will be continuous while Dooku is still around. I'll find Dooku, you just go after Grievous, Bastila answered. Understood, he agreed. R2 then began to send out a series of bleeps and chirps. Alright, this is where the fun begins, Anakin commented, smiling behind his mask. Doing a barrel roll, he heard the droid let out another series of whirls. Aiming at the shield generator, he fired several blasts, destroying it. The doors began closing, and Anakin flew into the ship before ejecting himself from the fighter, and started fighting the droids that went to attack him. Spinning his lightsaber around, the droids stood no chance against the double-sided blade. Getting rid of the droids surrounding him, Anakin looked around as he deactivated his weapon. Looking around, Anakin let out a deep breath as he went to find the general of the ship. Don't move. A voice called out. Spinning around with his weapon drawn, the vigilante went to kill whoever he thought was about to kill him, when he saw a familiar face standing there. Well, Jango Fett, he commented. That's this, the bounty hunter answered, a hint of a chuckle in his voice. You're the last person I expect to see here, he commented. I figured if you were going to go to destroy an enemy's strongpoint, your first target would be General Grievous, Jango answered. Anakin nodded, keeping his lightsaber raised. And you plan to stop me? he asked. No, I'm actually here to help you get to Grievous in one piece, he answered. Thanks, but I really don't think I need your help, Anakin told him. On the contrary, I think you'll need some backup when Grievous sends out his army of droids, Jango answered. Anakin stared at the bounty hunter before nodding. Alright, he answered before they started running through the halls to find Grievous. So we have there the infamous Justice and the traitor, Jango, Grievous sneered as they turned a corner. Anakin ignited his lightsaber again. You're under arrest for crimes against the Senate, he informed his enemy. You are full, Justice. I have been trained in the Jedi arts by Count Dooku, Grievous answered before he started hacking. Anakin held his lightsaber up as the general began attacking the vigilante. While Anakin fought Grievous, Jango was keeping the droids at bay, so they wouldn't try to attack the young man from behind. Anakin blocked the 6 lightsabers aimed at him, using both sides of his lightsaber to block the attacks. Jumping over the general's head, Anakin dropped down to one knee on the floor to use his lightsaber to swipe Grievous's legs with the blade. The creature jumped over the young man's head while trying to cut Anakin's head off his shoulders. Rolling across the ground, Anakin grabbed a discarded blaster that was on the floor, aiming several blasts at the enemy. Grievous blocked the blasts before throwing the lightsaber at his head. Anakin held his lightsaber up, which cut the hilt of the other lightsaber in two, destroying the weapon. I will be looking forward to adding your lightsaber to my collection, Grievous said with a grin. I don't think so, Anakin answered. Holding his hand up, Anakin lifted Grievous off the floor, throwing him into the far wall. Grievous was quick to jump back to his feet, grabbing his discarded lightsabers. Anakin held his hand up, and the general began grabbing at his throat, gasping for air. Knowing his enemy was weak, Anakin threw him again. This time Grievous was struggling to get back up, hacking and coughing worse than before. Surrender, Grievous, Anakin told him, holding his lightsaber close to his face. And never, Grievous answered, hacking some more. Grabbing the lightsaber by his head, Grievous went to stab it through Anakin's middle, when the attack was blocked, and he sliced the other side of his blade through Grievous's head, killing him instantly. Removing the blade from the mechanical carcass, Anakin deactivated his lightsaber, reattaching it to his belt. Self-destruct sequence activated, the computer recited, its voice echoing off the walls. Great, the last thing we need, Anakin commented, looking at Jango. Let's get out of here, Jango answered as they started running down the hall back to the main hangar. Anakin held his comlink up. R2, get the ship ready for takeoff, now, he ordered. R2 chirped for his answer. Running to the main hangar, Anakin glanced over to see Jango climbing into his own fighter before he quickly got in his. Lifting off, Anakin blasted through the main hangar doors before flying through with Jango's fighter right behind his. Just making it out as the ship exploded, Anakin looked over at Jango's fighter. Till we meet again, my friend, Jango commented. Till we meet again, Anakin answered before the bounty hunter flew off. Anakin held his comlink up again. Bastila, Grievous is destroyed, he informed his friend. Wonderful, Anakin. Return to Naboo, I will meet up with you there, Bastila answered. Understood, he answered before grinning widely. Oh, and Anakin, make sure you get your family from Tatooine first, she added. Right, Anakin agreed before flying towards Tatooine. When he arrived on Tatooine, Anakin smiled when he saw his mother coming out of the hovel. Anakin, Shmai said excitedly as she walked over to her son. Jumping out of his fighter, Anakin removed his helmet before embracing his mother. Hi Mom, he said smiling, hugging her a little tighter. Shmai pulled back, resting her hands on her son's face. You grow handsomer every time I see you, she told him, beaming. Mom, he said with a sigh, making her laugh softly. What brings you to Tatooine? Shmai asked. I'm here to bring everyone to Naboo, he replied. And that little fighter? Owen quipped as he walked over. Anakin chuckled as he briefly embraced his stepbrother. No, of course not, he answered before hugging Bear. He shook Clegg's hand as he walked over. No, I've been working on a project over at mine in Bastila's hovel, he stated to them. He grabbed his helmet while R2 rolled behind him, whistling and chirping happily as they walked over to the land speeder waiting for them. Alright R2, enough, Anakin said chuckling. They got into the speeder before heading off to the hovel he and Bastila shared when they would live on Tatooine. Once they arrived, Anakin smiled as he reached into his utility belt and pulled out a controller. Hitting a few buttons, Balar's eyes widened when a large ship appeared in front of them. How did you do that? Owen asked in disbelief. I took an old abandoned junk ship and rebuilt it, Anakin replied. You rebuilt this? Bear asked in awe. Yes, Anakin replied. Anakin, this is incredible. Shmai told him with a smile. Anakin smiled to see the pride on his mother's face. So how about we head back to the hovel so you can gather your things, and then we can go to Naboo? He suggested. We can't just leave the farm though, Clegg told him. Dad, we can set up the security system while we're gone, and the droids can dust the crops, Owen answered. It looks like Anakin's finally going to marry the senator. We shouldn't miss it, since it's all Mom and Bear talk about. Shmai shoved her stepson a little, laughing. Anakin laughed before they went to prepare for their trip to Naboo. Back on Naboo, Padme was sitting in her room looking over her slavery abolish bill when Sola came in. Padme, your dress came in today, she informed smiling, sitting on her sister's bed. Can you have it brought up to my room? Padme asked as she continued to read over her bill. Alright, and Max Iron sent a transmission saying that he'll be ready to perform the ceremony whenever you're ready, Sola told her sister excitedly. At this rate, Sola, I don't think there's going to be a wedding until after the war is over with, Padme replied. I doubt Anakin will have you wait that long, Sola answered. Padme glanced at her sister, swinging her legs over the side of the chaise she was sitting on. Sola, Anakin's too busy to fight in a war. The wedding will happen when everything is calmer, she replied. She looked up when Jobel came in with her dress. Would you at least look at it? Sola asked, rolling her eyes at her sister. Sighing, Padme nodded and put her datapad down. Her mother opened the bag the dress was in, and her eyes widened when she saw her wedding gown for the first time. It was gorgeous, everything she imagined and more. Padme, will you at least consider having some of our neighbors invited? Jobel asked. They have been our trusted friends since before you were born. Mom, how can we invite people to a wedding when we don't know when it's going to happen? Padme asked. Jobel rested her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Alright, try your dress on at least, so we can see if it fits, Sola insisted. Padme sighed, shaking her head slowly, but to humor her mother and her sister, she went into the fresher to try on her wedding gown. Anakin smiled as he led his family through the neighborhood toward Padme's family's house. This place is so incredible, Bear said in awe as she looked around. I have never seen so much color in one place, Owen commented. Naboo is more colorful than Tatooine, Anakin answered with a half grin when they walked up to the Naberi home. He smiled when Ryu and Pruha hurried around the corner. Anakin, they exclaimed excitedly, running to greet him. He embraced them both, making the girls laugh as he easily lifted them up in his arms and swung them around in a couple of circles before setting them back down. Wow, are you two getting so big, he commented. Pruha peeked around Anakin to see Shmai there. Hi Shmai, she said smiling as she hurried over to embrace her. Shmai smiled as she hugged the girl. Hi Pruha, you have gotten bigger since the last time I saw you, she commented when Ryu hurried over to join in on the hug. Anakin chuckled lightly before looking at the others. Ryu, Pruha, this is my father, Klieg, my brother Owen, and his wife, Bear, he informed the smiling girls. The girls waved with a smile. They laughed when Ryu was suddenly at Anakin's side, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. This one's Ryu and the girl beside Mom is Pruha, he informed his family. Nice to meet you young ladies, Klieg said with a smile. Anakin smiled to see that the families were finally going to meet instead of just the simple transmissions they would send whenever he visited Naboo. Where's your aunt? He asked. She's upstairs with Mom and Grandma, apparently her dress came in, and Mom's been wanting Aunt Padme to try it on all day, Ryu replied. Sounds like your aunt to keep Sola in suspense, Anakin answered as he pried himself from the girl's tight grip. Owen was chuckling at the starry look on the girl's face as they went upstairs while the girls played with R2 outside. I think the girl has a crush on you, he quipped. Anakin laughed as he continued to walk up the steps into the house. Going inside, Anakin introduced his family to Rui and Dard. So are they still dressing Padme up? Anakin quipped. The dress has been sitting in the den all day, Rui replied chuckling. Anakin smiled when he glanced up the stairs. Anakin, don't you even think about it, Shmai scolded lightly. I wasn't going to do anything Mom, he answered innocently. Yes, we all know how innocent you truly are Anakin, Bastila quipped as she walked in. Anakin smiled as he looked at her. Bastila, it's good to see you, he told her. Smiling, Bastila walked over and embraced the young man. I am very proud of you for defeating Grievous, she told him. Pulling back, she smiled softly at him before letting him go. I'm afraid to ask, when is my next mission? He asked curiously. Whatever you feel it is time for another mission, she replied. He furrowed his brow in confusion. What do you mean? He asked. I have taught you all that I could with the Force. You have grown more powerful than any Force-sensitive person I have ever met. You are able to control your emotions. I don't sense the same amount of fear and anger you had felt when we first met, she explained. Anakin smiled as he listened to her. You're no longer my apprentice, Anakin. You have finished your training, she finished smiling softly at him. It was an honor training with you, he told her, bowing to her with deep respect. Bastila smiled as she bowed back to him. This is so wonderful, Ani. Shmai told her son as she embraced him. Anakin hugged his mother back, while the rest of the family congratulated him. Anakin? Padme asked. Turning around, Anakin felt his heart speed up when he saw the love of his life standing there. Hurrying over, he lifted her up into his arms and hugged her tight. Padme hugged him back, smiling when it sank in that he was back home again. Now you two can finally plan that wedding, Sola commented, making every laugh. Anakin chuckled lightly as he continued to hug Padme. That's what I plan on doing, he answered smiling. Padme hugged him tighter with a bigger smile. Congratulations, Ani, I knew you could do it, she said softly. Anakin smiled as he kissed her shoulder. So where is this wedding taking place? Shmai asked smiling. Verkino, it's a beautiful place. The perfect place, Anakin replied, wrapping his arm around Padme's waist. Well, let's get everything together and go to Verkino, Jobel said smiling. Anakin smiled as he hugged Padme once more before she went upstairs to get her things ready. We should just celebrate while we can. I have so much work to do yet, he murmured softly. Feeling a hand on his shoulder, he saw his mother standing there. "Ani, don't worry about that now. Let's just have one good trip without worrying about the war," she told him gently. Smiling at his mother, he nodded slowly and rested his hand over hers. That next evening after they arrived at the lake country, even Obi-Wan was able to escape from his mission unnoticed by the council to stand by his best friend's side as best man. When it came time for the ceremony, Anakin was standing by the holy man waiting for Padme. Solo was standing across from them acting as Padme's matron of honor. The rest of their family and close friends were there waiting anxiously for the bride. Letting out a deep breath, Anakin glanced over at R2-D2 to see the little astro droid recording every bit of the beginning ceremony. Smiling, he stood up straighter when Rui began escorting Padme out onto the terrace, and Anakin's eyes grew wide. She was possibly the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Padme was smiling softly at Anakin while holding onto her father's arm. After Rui placed Padme's hand in Anakin's waiting hand, he sat down as the holy man began the ceremony. The setting was perfect, the sun had begun to set, and the beautiful colors of the sunset reflected off the water. "I, Anakin Skywalker, take you Padme Barry to be my wife. I promise to be a loving and supporting husband. My heart and soul are forever entwined with yours. When you hurt, I hurt. When you cry, I will be the shoulder for you to lean on. When you are happy, I will be happier to see your smile. Forever will I be loyal and be the best husband for you," he vowed. Padme smiled as she gripped his hands tightly. "I, Padme Barry, take you Anakin Skywalker to be my husband. I promise to be a loving and supporting wife. My heart and soul are forever entwined with yours. When you hurt, I hurt. When you cry, I will be the shoulder for you to lean on. When you are happy, I will be happier to see your smile. Forever will I be loyal and be the best wife for you," she vowed in return. Anakin smiled as he gave her hands a gentle squeeze. "Rings?" the holy man asked. Obi-Wan cleared his throat as he handed the man the rings Anakin had made. They were made of a metal rod with beautiful vine-like engravings on the sides. Anakin took one ring and held Padme's hand up. "With this ring, I bind my heart, my soul, and my future to you. No matter how far apart life takes us, I will always come back to you," he vowed. Padme smiled as she took the other ring and slipped it over Anakin's finger. "With this ring, I bind my heart, my soul, and my future to you. No matter where our lives take us, apart or together, I'm forever yours," she vowed in return. Anakin gave her a half smile as he listened to the holy man give more blessings over the union. "By the powers of the Maker, I now pronounce you man and wife," the holy man informed. Feeling his heart soar, Anakin leaned forward and pressed his lips against Padme's. Kissing him back, Padme wrapped her arms around his back with a smile. After sharing their first kiss as husband and wife, everyone stood up, clapping for the newlyweds before they went to congratulate them all. This day couldn't be even more perfect, not even the war could ruin it. Pulling his wife back into his arms, Anakin kissed his wife gently again with a small smile. "I love you," he said softly. "I love you," she answered smiling as he hugged her tight. 3.5 months later, Padme was walking down the hall wearing one of her usual gorgeous senatorial gowns. It was a dark purple with black trimming around her collar, sleeves, and hem. Around her waist was a black belt with the Naboo crest on the front. Her hair was tied up in a tight bun with a headdress that had dark purple beads flowing around her head, and the Naboo crest hung above her brow. Letting out a deep breath, she looked over at Tifo. "Are you ready, Melody?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be, Captain," she answered. Placing her hand on her stomach briefly, she lifted her head high as usual as she entered her seat. "The chair recognizes Senator Amidala. You have told us you have a bill you would like to propose." Palpatine asked. "Yes, Chancellor. Over 13 years ago when I had gone into hiding as queen, I had landed on the remote planet of Tatooine. While I was there, I had come across a slave boy and his mother. It surprised and horrified me that there was still slavery in the galaxy. While we are here worrying about our own supplies to get to our own planets, we still have our freedom," she explained. She heard the shouts of good and bad thrown at her. "Order, we will have order," Mazumeta called out. Padme cleared her throat. "While we still have our freedom, there are hundreds even thousands of people who have no freedom at all. Children are being torn from their parents, never to see them again. The few lucky children who are able to stay with families are being negotiated for prices like we negotiate for food and supplies for our people," she explained. Padme glanced around at all the arguing senators in the room. "I am proposing the Republic finally does something and step in for the planets that we haven't gone before. We must abolish slavery. It is cruel to buy and use people like they are property. We are not property, it must be stopped," she concluded. Through her whole speech, all Padme could do was think about Anakin and Shmai. How their living conditions were, how Anakin described Gardella the Hutt. "Senator Amidala, as noble your actions are, I do believe you have too much of a personal attachment to this certain situation," Palpatine informed the young woman. Padme was silent. "I have to apologize, Senator, but a simple abolish bill isn't as important as the situation of the war is for now. Your request for your bill to be put into vote is denied," Palpatine informed. The young woman felt her heart drop to the pit of her stomach before the Chancellor went to the next proposal. Sitting down, she suddenly felt like she had failed her husband. For the last 4 years she was working on this bill only to have it rejected. She lowered her head dejectedly with a sad sigh. On Tatooine, Anakin was walking through Mos Espa to talk to Watto about a part for his father's broken-down speeder when he heard a child crying out in pain. "Stupid pedunky." Someone snarled in Huttese. "Stupid boy." Turning around, Anakin saw a boy get thrown to the dirt groan, obviously trying to back away from his owner's next blow. "Dampene Canuta." He snapped again, kicking the boy. "Waste of money. Don't." The boy exclaimed, curling up further. Seeing the terrified look in the child's eyes and the fact no one was helping made Anakin's blood boil. Walking up behind the slave owner, he grabbed the creature around the throat, yanking it back. "Ripu pedunky enki," he hissed. "Leave the boy be. Ma shag. Yuvaru." The slave owner snapped. "My slave. You leave." Anakin pulled out his blade. "You pedunky na kispa," he hissed before stabbing the blade through the slave owner. "The boy is free." Walking over to the injured boy, Anakin easily lifted him up and carried him away. Walking to his and Bastila's old hovel, he placed the boy down. "Alright, let's have a look," he commented. "Go away." The boy snapped, pushing him back. Shaking his head slowly, Anakin went into the fresh air and brought out some bacta. "I'm here to help, not to hurt," he assured the boy. The boy looked at him curiously. "Why?" he asked. "I was once a slave, I've gotten some beatings in my time," he commented as he placed bacta on the cut on the boy's chin. "Yea, that might scar a little." The boy stared at the scar over Anakin's eye. "What's your name?" Anakin asked. "Han," the boy replied. "Han Solo." "Well, Han, my name is Anakin. You have nothing to worry about. Do you know where your parents are?" he asked. Han shook his head slowly. "I haven't seen them since I was sold to that human-sized slug," he replied, making Anakin chuckle. "Well, while I search for your parents, how about you come to Coruscant with me?" he asked. Han raised his eyebrow. "What's the catch?" he asked. "No catch," Anakin replied. The boy stared at him curiously. "Sure, I'd like to get off this dust ball," he answered, making Anakin laugh a little more. "Yeah, I was never so fond of this planet either, but I have family here. That's the only reason why I come back," he commented. The boy just stared at him quizzically. "How did you get freed from slavery then?" he asked curiously. "Long story, come on, you should rest. You've had a rough day," he commented. Han let out a sigh, but nodded his head slowly. Anakin had the boy sleep in his old room and sat down to watch the holonet. Today during the Senate meeting, Senator Amidala made a motion for slavery to be abolished on planets where the Republic doesn't exist, the reporter explained, making Anakin's heart sink. Pinching the bridge of his nose, he let out a frustrated sigh. "Blast the Senate, blast the Republic," he hissed angrily. Standing up, Anakin let out a frustrated breath before he stormed to his ship that sat outside. Pulling on his armor, Anakin walked over to R2 who was checking the ship for any sort of damages. "R2, I need you to connect me to the holonet," he told the droid. "Beep, blip, beep whirl," R2 answered. "Just do it, R2, he ordered the droid. R2 let out another series of beeps before he did what Anakin had asked him. When he knew he hacked into the holonet system, he stood straight with his shoulders squared. "Good evening everyone, if you are unsure of who I am. I am Justice, the rogue you have heard about over the last 3 years," he spoke. Anakin stood there in his full armor, mask and all, making sure no one could ever recognize him. "I have heard of Senator Amidala's noble request for abolishing slavery, something only someone with such courage and bravery to even think about others. It disgusts me that the Senate denied such a motion, something that could show that the Republic cares for more than just their own planets, their own means, than wanting to help the planets that are practically begging for the help," he informed everyone who was watching. Anakin closed his eyes for a second to keep his anger back. "I am disgusted with the Republic as I always have, just as I have been disgusted with the Separatists. I hold no alliance to either side, for I do what I believe is right by others and myself. As of this day, I am declaring war on slavery, and all those who either support it or choose not to help abolish it," he explained. After making his declaration, he had R2 cut the transmission before removing his helmet. Sitting down, he closed his eyes with a heavy sigh. Back on Coruscant, Padme was standing in hers and Anakin's apartment with wide eyes, having seen Anakin's broadcast. She let out a gasp as she placed her hand over her stomach and slowly sat down in disbelief. "Milady, are you alright?" Cord asked. "I'm fine, Cord," she answered softly as she stared at the now blank screen. "I'd just like to be alone, please." "Yes, Milady," she answered before leaving. Once she was alone, Padme swallowed hard when she held her comlink up. "Ani," she called on the other end, hoping he would pick up. "I'm here, Padme," she told him softly. Rubbing her forehead, she let out a deep breath. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Why?" "It was nothing you did," he answered. "I failed to fight harder to pass the bill," she told him. "You did your part, even though you didn't have to do it. You really didn't have to even create it," he answered. "I wanted to, after hearing what you and your mother went for. I felt that something should have been done," she said softly. She heard him sigh on his end. "Padme, you did nothing wrong. It was the Republic, it was always the Republic and the Jedi. They have done nothing to help me," he answered. Forcing the tears from her eyes, she let out a deep breath, but he could hear her sniffling. Padme, don't cry, Angel. Everything will be alright, he assured her. I know it will be, she answered. She cleared her throat. I miss you, she told him. I miss you, I'll be home soon, he assured her. Padme smiled a little. I have to go now, Padme. I'll see you soon, he told her. I'll see you soon. I love you, she said softly. I love you, he answered before they cut transmission. Sitting back in her chair, Padme smiled a little as she continued to caress her stomach. Wait until your daddy finds out about you, little one, she said softly, smiling a little more. She couldn't wait to tell Anakin she was pregnant. Even though she could have told him over the comlink, she felt this was something to tell him face to face. She wanted to see his reaction over the news. When she found out about she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. She was smiling and crying at the same time, especially when she heard her baby's heartbeat for the first time. It was the most magical moment of her life, knowing that she and Anakin created life together. Finally able to relax, she reached over beside her and turned on her music player, listening to the music that was filling the room. As she closed her eyes, a mental image filled her mind. She pictured a beautiful boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, an image of his father. Feeling exhaustion take over her, she kept her hands over her barely there baby bump as she fell asleep in her chair. A month later, back on Tatooine, Anakin was in the den area meditating to try to calm his nerves. Except, as he opened his mind to the Force as Bastila taught him, a disturbing vision appeared in his mind. Obi-Wan was locked in a deadlock with Dooku on a ship he didn't recognize. He watched as the Sith Lord suddenly used the Force choke on his friend. Obi-Wan. He called out to his friend, but alas his call couldn't be heard. Anakin watched in horror as Obi-Wan was crushed under a platform, and Dooku stood over the Jedi Master. And this is the end of Obi-Wan Kenobi, he commented as he raised his lightsaber. Anakin's eyes snapped open. No. He exclaimed. Jumping to his feet, he hurried into the room to wake Han. He had to get to Obi-Wan before it was too late. After sending a message to his mother that he wouldn't be able to return to their hovel, he got Han onto the ship before they left Tatooine to go to Coruscant to save his friend from a horrible death at the hands of Dooku. When they arrived close to Coruscant, he saw a large battle had broken out, and he had heard from Bastila that the Chancellor was kidnapped. No wonder why they had sent Obi-Wan to do this, he commented. Sighing, he looked at Han. Han, stay here and keep watch of the ship, he instructed. No problem, Han answered as he sat back in the pilot's chair with his feet propped up on the control panel. Shaking his head slowly, Anakin went over to the small hangar where his fighter sat. Climbing in, he smiled when R2 was in place on the wing. Ready, R2? He asked. The droid beeped while Anakin put on his mask. The platform opened and Anakin took off from his larger ship, heading towards Dooku's ship. Dodging several blasts aimed at him, Anakin took aim and fired at many droids that were aiming to tear his ship apart. Doing a barrel roll, the young man was able to pinpoint Dooku's ship. R2, I'm going to launch you off the wing so you can get the blast doors open, can you do it? He asked. Beep, beep, chirp, R2 answered. Alright, get ready, Anakin told the droid. Just as he passed over the ship, Anakin hit the eject button, and the droid shot like a blaster shot to the roof of the ship. R2 was able to use his little rockets to circle around the ship to find the computer terminal to get the doors open. While his trusted droid was working to get the doors open, Anakin continued to fire at the large guns that would aim at the little astro droid. Come on R2, he muttered as he intercepted another blast. He could hear the droid chirp just as the doors opened. Great work R2, Anakin told him as he hit the button for the cable to shoot out from the bottom of his fighter, and attached itself to the droid. Flying into the main hangar, the droid got out of its cable confines to get the doors to close again. Once the doors were closed, Anakin looked at R2. R2, stay here until I call for you, he ordered. Bleep, bleep, R2 answered. Nodding, Anakin ignited both sides of his lightsaber as he tracked Obi-Wan with the Force. Arriving at a room, he made it just in time as the platform landed on top of his friend. This is the end of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Dooku commented as he raised his lightsaber over his head. No? Anakin shouted. Running over, he leapt in front of his unconscious friend, blocking the attack. Well, just as we meet at last, Dooku commented. How cowardly of you to destroy a man when he's unable to defend himself, Anakin answered, kicking the Sith Lord backwards. Dooku only grinned as he began fighting the vigilante before him. When he was able to gain the upper hand, he threw Anakin backwards into a wall. Just as you disappoint me. The stories I have heard made you more powerful than you appear, he sneered. Anakin was lying on the floor, waiting for Dooku to come closer. As the Sith Lord strode toward him, he didn't know the young man was powering up his telepathic abilities, concentrating hard. Just when Dooku stood above him, Anakin held his hands up and shoved him backwards with all the strength he had conjured up. From the impact, Dooku flew through the air and hit the rail before falling limp on the floor. Seeing that the Sith Lord was incapacitated, he walked over to the Chancellor and undid his shackles. You should kill him, he insisted. He's a defenseless person and I'm not one to kill one who is unable to defend himself, Anakin replied. Palpatine stared at the armored man in front of him. You are declaring war on the Republic, but yet you come save the Chancellor, he commented. Don't think of yourself as all that important to me, my lord. I'm here for my friend, Anakin replied before hurrying over to Obi-Wan's unconscious form. Bending down, he turned his friend over onto his back, making sure he was alright. He seems to be alright, he commented. Leave him or we'll never make it, Palpatine insisted. Anakin felt anger rush through his system over what Palpatine had told him. His fate will be the same as ours, he told him, leaving no room for argument. Hoisting Obi-Wan up onto his shoulders, they went to escape the ship. While they were trying to escape, Dooku had gone through his own secret passageway to the bridge, just as the ship started heading downwards toward Coruscant. Pulling themselves through the elevator, they started running down the elevator shaft. Just when the ship began to level out again, Anakin grabbed some wires, wincing with 2 people hanging on him. Blast, this job became even more difficult than I thought, he muttered. He grabbed his comlink. Han, can you hear me? He asked. I hear you, Han answered. Can you pilot the ship? Anakin asked. You bet, Han replied. Get that ship over here as fast as you can. I'll give you the signal to have the hatch open for us to get in, he instructed. You got it, sir, Han replied. Anakin let out a deep breath when Obi-Wan suddenly woke up and moved to grab onto his friend. Easy, we're in a bit of a situation here, he commented. Did I miss something? Obi-Wan asked, stunned about everything. Hold on, the younger man answered. What's that? Obi-Wan asked as they looked up. They looked up as the elevator started racing toward them. Oops, R2, shut down the elevator, Anakin said into his comlink. Too late, jump, Obi-Wan answered as they started sliding down the elevator shaft. Both reaching for their cables on their utility belts, they were able to swing them around a metal bar, before they swung into another hall with the Chancellor still hanging onto their legs. Anakin lied back on the floor, letting out a deep breath. These missions are becoming more than I can handle, he commented. What in the blazes are you doing here anyway? Obi-Wan asked as he helped his friend up. Had a feeling you needed help, Anakin replied simply. Anakin let out a deep breath. So, from my understanding is justice, you were once Senator Amidala's bodyguard, Palpatine started. I still am, when I can. When I'm not doing other jobs, Anakin replied simply, not wishing to give the Chancellor the time of day. We need to get out of here before we get caught, Obi-Wan told him. Right, I have a ride waiting for us, Anakin answered just as the alarms went off. Great, another self-destruct. Anakin shook his head slowly. Everywhere I go this happens, I can't seem to escape this, he commented as the 3 of them started running down the hall. When they reached an escape hatch, Anakin held his comlink up. Han, do you copy? He asked. Loud and clear, Justice, the boy answered. Do you have a lock on where we are? Anakin asked. Yep, coming right up under you, Han replied. Anakin let out a deep breath. That sounds like just a child, Palpatine commented. Former slave, told you that I'm declaring war on slavery, Your Excellency, Anakin answered with a slight sneer in his voice. Justice, I'm right under you, Han called. Are the hatches connected? Anakin asked. No, I thought I'd just let you fly into space, the boy replied sarcastically. Anakin chuckled behind his mask as he opened the hatch. After you, my lord, Obi-Wan told him. Palpatine went in first before Anakin looked up. Lasted R2, where are you? He muttered. Suddenly the little droid let out a shriek before crashing into the wall. Come on R2, Anakin called out as Obi-Wan climbed through the hatch. The little droid moved as fast as his wheels could take him, but with time running out, Anakin grabbed it with the force. With the trusty little astro droid in the hatch, the vigilante slid through and closed the hatch behind him. Han, get us out of here, he called out. You got it, Han answered before flying off just as the ship blew up. The downside was, the explosion forced the ship into Coruscant's atmosphere too fast. We're coming in too hot, Anakin commented as he sat in the pilot's chair. Grab that gear, Han, keep us level. Han listened to what Anakin was telling him. Force, I can feel the back of this thing coming apart. The rear shield still had to be repaired, he muttered. 1 second, Han told him. Anakin watched his hand suddenly grabbed a hold of the controls, swinging the ship around a little. She's all yours, Justice, Han told him. The shaking began to stop a little, and the alarms seemed to calm a little. Great job, Han, great job, Anakin answered when they found an empty ramp open for them to land. Help me pull up. Han helped his new friend land the ship safely, and they sat back in relief. Another happy landing, Obi-Wan commented, making the 2 pilots laugh a little. Anakin let out a deep breath. Han Solo, meet my good friend, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, Justice told him. Han shook his hand with a grin. Nice flying there, Han, Obi-Wan commented. Yep, I know a trick or two, he quipped. And Chancellor Palpatine, Anakin answered with so little respect for this man. Han bowed respectively to the man before they exited the ship. When they arrived at the Senate building, Justice was walking with Han, listening to the Chancellor praise the young man's brave efforts, even though Dooku was still in control. As Anakin was walking alongside Organa, only half listening to what he was saying. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw his wife standing in the dark, making him smile behind his mask. Han looked around to see the woman standing there and looked at his new friend curiously. Excuse me, Senator, could you take my friend Han and have him treated with a hot meal and fresh clothing? Anakin asked. Certainly, Organa answered as he led Han away. Once he knew that he wasn't seen, Anakin smiled as he hurried over to his wife and lifted her up off the floor, swinging her around once. Setting her back down, Pad let out a deep sigh as she held onto him. There were whispers that you had been killed after you declared war against slavery, she told him, her voice hinting how terrified she had been over the last month and a half. I'm alright, he assured her. Let's get home so I can get this armor off. Pad nodded as she held onto her husband's hand and they left the Senate building. When they arrived home, the first thing Pad did was remove his helmet and kissed him deeply. Anakin kissed her back, hugging her close once their kiss broke. I've missed you, he whispered into her shoulder. I miss you, she answered, hugging him tighter. He rested his forehead against the side of her head, moving his hands over her arms, when he felt her tremble a little. Are you alright? You're trembling, he said softly, pulling back. Padme smiled as she held onto his arms. Something wonderful has happened. Ani, I'm pregnant, she told him softly. Feeling nothing but joy swell up in his heart, Anakin lifted his wife up in his arms again, hugging her close. That's wonderful, Angel, he told her, kissing her cheek, neck, and shoulder. Setting her down again, he kissed her gently. Does anyone else know? He asked. My sister knows, she was there when I found out, she replied. No one else knows. He asked. I wanted you to be the first person I told, she replied. Anakin kissed her gently. That's wonderful, so wonderful. This is the happiest day of my life, next to marrying you, he said softly. Padme smiled and hugged him again. Back at the Jedi temple, Obi-Wan was going to head inside when he saw Bastila standing there waiting for him. Are you alright? She asked. I'm alright, a little bruised, he answered. She surprised him when she suddenly embraced him. Standing still for a minute, Obi-Wan slowly wrapped his arms around her waist and hugged her back. I'm just so glad you're safe, she said softly. It's going to take more than a Sith Lord to get rid of me, he answered, chuckling lightly. Bastila smiled as she let him go finally after another minute. How long are you going to be on Coruscant? He asked. Ani and I decided that we're going to stay here and spy on the Senate for a while. The dark side of the Force is surrounding the Chancellor, she replied. The Council has been sensing that as well, Obi-Wan agreed. She let out a sigh when she glanced at the temple and then back at Obi-Wan. You should go, Master Jedi, she quipped lightly, making him laugh. Reaching up, she rested her hand on his cheek with a gentle smile. I am glad you're alright, she said softly. Thank your concern, he answered. Keeping her hand on his cheek for one more minute, she let her hand drop to her side before walking away. Obi-Wan let out a deep breath as he watched her walk away, suddenly feeling a little conflicted with the situation. He turned around and went into the temple for his next briefing.